Hello. I was due to be interviewed by William Ramsey on the 14th of March, and we connected a few hours before the show to do a technical test, and he was not happy at all with the quality of the sound, so he decided to cancel the interview, which was very annoying because he insisted on using StreamYard, which I told him in advance I don't use because it never gives good results for me. And he would not use Zoom. And he insisted that it was my problem, my connection, my phone, etc. So he was very disrespectful, and I didn't like that much. That was the first time I'd spoken to him. So it ended unamicably, unfortunately. But I'm sorry for those of you that had tuned in expecting to see the live stream of the interview. So I thought I would make a brief audio of what I was going to say during the interview for those of you that are interested. The subject is The New Atheism Hoax, which is a book I've written. The New Atheism is a philosophical genre which, as the name suggests, says that the world would be better off without organized religion, and that the idea of God is irrational and therefore not worthy of human thought. And the leading academics in this field are Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and the late Christopher Hitchens. And their ideas came about 20 years ago. That's why I wrote the book. It's the 20th anniversary of this idea. And they pride themselves on having Enlightenment-era rationalism. So roughly 17th to 19th century European thinking. Playwrights, poets, philosophers, natural philosophers, which we now call scientists. These people led the Enlightenment, and they said no gods, no masters, because at the time the Catholic Church was dominant in Europe, and Protestantism was coming along to challenge that dominance. But there were a third group of people, the Enlightenment philosophers. Now, what the New Atheists don't tell you about the fundamentals of their idea is that a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers were occultists. Voltaire, for example, was a Freemason, and Voltaire's views on free speech are more important than ever because, of course, everybody's being cancelled and free speech is being destroyed through the culture and through legislation. Now, it's not as if the New Atheists acknowledge this to say that their whole philosophy was based on people that were occultists. They just don't talk about it. Apparently it's too embarrassing for them to acknowledge this. Richard Dawkins, for example, a Darwinist evolutionary biologist at the University of Oxford, a fellow of the Royal Society, the oldest scientific institute in the world. It turns out the Royal Society was pretty much founded by Rosicrucians. There is a fantastic book called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, which was written by Dame Frances Yates. Now, of course, Dame Yates meant that she was part of the British establishment, the British Empire. And she wrote some fantastic books, and in that book she lays out the history of how the Royal Society was founded and how many of the practitioners were occultists, the occult sciences. And in that book, she found some documentation, very interesting illustration called The Cave of the Illuminati. And it depicts an initiation in a cave, which is very important because caves have a multi-layered significance, which I can get into another time. And if you look at the Collins English Dictionary, for those who say, oh, the Illuminati doesn't exist, the mid-90s edition of that dictionary had 3 definitions of Illuminati. The first was the 16th century Alumbrados, the Spanish Gnostic sect that was opposed to the Catholic Church and the Inquisition. And the second, it says Illuminati was another name for the Rosicrucians. And here Frances Yates has this illustration in her book. And of course the third definition is the most famous Adam Weishaupt's Bavarian Illuminati from the 18th century. And the website California Masons, for example, talks about how even into the 20th century, certain Masonic groups were meeting in caves and conducting rituals in caves, and they even present some photographic evidence. So that's just to illustrate that beneath the surface of apparent scientific rationalism there were these occult ideas. And one of the most famous scientists, Isaac Newton, at the time, of course, they believed the world was like a clock, the mechanistic theory of reality, and that somehow humans could become gods by reconstructing the world as if it were a machine. But where that theory collapsed was with trying to replicate the tides. They couldn't replicate tidal movements because they didn't know about electromagnetic energy. So they knew there was some kind of force there, but they didn't know what it was. And Newton realized that in the Mathematica Principia and other works, he was disproving the mechanical theory. But he thought it was so absurd, he tried to prove that it was real and couldn't. And in his occult works, he believed that the ancient Egyptians, our ancestors, did have access to higher knowledge, and that's how they constructed their so-called civilizations, which of course were hierarchies with slaves and so on. And he was also an alchemist. There's a rumor that he stared at the sun during one ritual in an attempt to gain higher knowledge and ended up going partially blind, and every time he'd close his eyes he'd see a golden sheen, so in an ironic way he got his wish to create gold. And not many people know about this. Scientists tend to want to forget about this because it's too embarrassing to say that from their point of view their heroes did have these so-called irrational beliefs. Now, moving into more recent times, 19th and 20th centuries, somebody online, I don't remember the name, but they created a chart of atheists from that period. The first one on their list was Karl Marx, who famously formulated the theory of communism. Now, there's no evidence that Marx was a Freemason, but there is a famous photo of him concealing his hand, which is the sign of the hidden hand. Now, skeptics say, well, that was just the fashion at the time, but it's quite a bizarre posture. So it's more likely that it was a signal to fellow members of an order. But Marx famously theorized dialectical materialism, which basically says that for every action like a revolution in society, there is a reaction, like the government crushing it. And that creates a synthesis, and this is what moves history forward. This is straight out of Hegel. This is Hegel's dialectic, and Hegel was a Freemason. So, in Morals and Dogma by Albert Pike, which he wrote for 32nd degree Masons of the Scottish Rite, he also talks about this. He says in personal life, in spiritual life, in nature, there's this triangulation of action, reaction, and solution, and that past, present, and future is an infinity of triangles. Next on the list, this person chose Nietzsche, who famously said that God is dead and we have killed him. Nietzsche also, by the way, makes a hidden hand gesture in one of the photographs of him in his youth. Nietzsche was all about the will to power, the will of the self, and being beyond good and evil, in his words, that these were just human ideas that had no worldly significance. And Aleister Crowley praised Nietzsche in an essay for this philosophy, so people interpreted Nietzsche as they wanted. And the third on the list was Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst, who split with his student Jung because Jung had a much more spiritual idea and experience of consciousness. And Freud said, no, it's just consciousness is a product of biology and that's all. People assumed Freud was not a Mason, but actually about 10 years ago somebody did find some documentation that he was. So we're seeing throughout so-called Enlightenment rationalism this undercurrent of occultism, which continued into the 20th century with these 19th and 20th century scientists and philosophers. And then you have Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, who said that once you've killed God and society doesn't benefit the individual, what are you left with other than existential crisis? So next we move to the 21st century with the new atheists, and this all started with Sam Harris, who wrote the book The End of Faith in 2004. And Harris is more on the spiritual side of atheists. He says that through meditation and the controlled use of substances you can transcend. So now we're getting into transhumanism. And of course there's a long history of drugs and the pharmaceutical industry and MK Ultra, but that's for another topic. Now, Sam Harris's mother is Susan Harris, the famous Hollywood producer and writer of shows like The Golden Girls. So he came from a privileged background, and he kick-started this new atheism. And, you know, the CIA, until the 70s, they had the so-called Tibet program. They were funding the Dalai Lama as a proxy against the central regime in China. And I found out that the funding didn't end there. The State Department started funding the so-called Tibet Fund and from the 1980s. And then from 2012, it's USAID that's been funding them. So US taxpayers are funding Tibetan independence. Sam Harris was a bodyguard for the Dalai Lama. So that raises questions about who he is and his intelligence connections. The next new atheist was the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who wrote Breaking the Spell. He argues that organized religion is a kind of mind virus. But his father, also called Daniel, turned out to be a spy. He had been recruited in the Second World War by the CIA's forerunner, the Central Intelligence Group. There was the OSS, and then the CIG, then the CIA. So Dennett Sr. worked for them, and his cover story was he was a cultural attaché in Lebanon. But really he was there to monitor the construction of pipelines, and he's quoted as saying that we must protect the oil at all costs. He died in 1947 when his son was 5 in a mysterious plane crash, and his daughter Charlotte has written a book about what happened to their father. Then we have Richard Dawkins, by far the most famous book in the New Atheism canon, The God Delusion, sold 2 million copies. And Dawkins actually comes from a history of colonialists, of British colonial administrators. His grandfather and his father was a colonial agriculturalist in Africa. And even today, Dawkins is praising the British Empire as being benevolent paternalism. So we see this return to the idea of the white man's burden, that we have to civilize the savages. Then we have the late Christopher Hitchens, who started out as a Marxist. I mentioned Marx earlier and the occult connections. By the end, Hitchens was a full-on Bush-supporting Republican who was even invited to lunch at the Pentagon. And George Bush, of course, postured as a Christian, but really he was from a Skull and Bones family. His father was Skull and Bones and also in the CIA and likely connected to the Kennedy assassination. But anyway, Hitchens' father, Eric, was a commander in the British Navy. So on the surface of scientific rationalism, we have a connection to the occult, and we also have each one of these people in some way is tied to intelligence or to colonialism. And this is what informed their view. And the new atheism came along at a very convenient time for Skull and Bones Bush, because 2003 Iraq was invaded, and Bush told the world it will be a quick operation to get rid of Saddam Hussein and bring democracy to Iraq. And it dragged on to a brutal decades-long occupation which killed 1 million people, on top of the 1 million that the British and Americans had already killed with sanctions in the 90s. And then a year later, 2004, Sam Harris has this book, The End of Faith, that Muslims are angry and violent not because of our foreign policy, but because of Islam. And that we invaded Iraq not because of the oil, but because God whispered in Bush's ear. So they were serving power by writing these books and writing them with convenient timing. And I call it the New Atheism hoax, because if you look at their sources, time after time, they take a source which originally says religion was not the cause of a particular conflict or act of terrorism or revolution, and they pick one line out of that and then twist it to make it seem as though religion was the cause. So they've violated basic academic protocol time and time again, and in my view concocted a hoax. So that's what I was going to say. Thank you for listening.